All right, welcome everybody to our third seminar of our History at UON seminar series, where we'll be hearing from Dr. Nicole Kimball. Before we start, as usual, I would like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, the Pamelon clan of the Wabacal people, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today we're very fortunate to hear from one of our alumni and current staff members, Dr. Nicole Kimball. Nicole finished her PhD last year, at the end of last year, and is a freshly minted PhD in that respect. And we're going to hear a bit of research from that PhD, but also research that will soon appear in the conversation. So lots of, it's a bit of a work in progress, and lots of feedback will no doubt be welcome. So without any further ado, I will pass it off to Nicole, who will talk to us about from Chronicle to Canon, classical style and insular tradition in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini. So I will just do a few little quick switches here and then pass it off to Nicole.
All right, I'm just going to do a quick check on how I changed this. How do I just
Should be able to use.
there we go. Cool.
Everybody can hear us online, hopefully.
Hopefully, wonderful. All right, thank you. I'm just going to start by following up on Ryan's acknowledgement of country by noting that at least part of this paper was actually written on the lands of the Camilleri people. So I would like to extend Ryan's thanks to the elders past, present, and emerging of those people. All right. So Morgan le Fay. So the rediscovery of classical authors in the 11th and 12th centuries, including Aristotle, Ovid, and Virgil, prompted a renewed interest in the Greco-Roman corpus. By the end of the 12th century, Ovid and Virgil had become popular school and university texts, extensively analysed and commented on in order to make them compatible with Christian teaching. Aspects of translation and the path that knowledge took also became increasingly important. And as Elizaveta Strakov notes, translation studies, so the transfer of knowledge, and translation imperi, the translation of empire or the arc of human history, were often intertwined in works that sought to borrow the authority of previous cultures. So the recovery of these texts alongside the influx of Arabic knowledge, and as a nod to Ryan, this has also increased contact with Byzantium, and the growing number of translations of Greek scientific literature, such as Aristotle, began to raise questions around the study of magic. Magic as a concept began to be defined in new ways, and distinctions were made between different types of magic. So this is where we get our high, low, white, black, demarcations that had lasting implications. The high pseudoscientific study of something comparable to magic, such as astrology, would be compared to the low practical efforts of the cunning man or woman. So really, it was very much where you fell on the acceptable, not acceptable scale of magic entirely depended on your socioeconomic status and your education. And as Edward Peters notes, medieval scholars theorized that with appropriate learning and intellectual discipline, humans might acquire knowledge about the natural world that was hidden from ordinary people, so this is the occult, but not inherently demonic. So this is well before magic is 100% demonic. They are still very much wrestling with that idea. And it's not unusual to find such scholars, especially those who specialized in astrology, in the various courts of the 12th century. Conversely, common magic was seen to be based in the superstitions of the illiterate and uneducated, and was thus seen as wrong, and increasingly over the following centuries, this is what becomes evil. This is your black magics. And it's only into this environment that the figure of Morgan le Fay arrives, appearing repeatedly in the literature of Western Europe, with each appearance reflecting the broader social changes around her. Primarily a figure of Arthurian romance, she is shown most often as the lover or opponent, and sometimes both, of various heroes and lover knights, with a particular focus on both Lancelot and Merlin. A variable figure, Morgan's representation acts as a cipher for the understanding of magic and its acceptance in each text in which she is found. And in an era in which the understanding of magic was heavily influenced by the rediscovery of classical texts, so too were the works of literature that depicted magical exploits. So it's my going theory that in the writing of this poem, the Vita Merlini, that Geoffrey relied on Greco-Roman representations of witchcraft, particularly of Circe and Medea, as the framework on which Morgan was formed. And part of that theory is he is doing that in an attempt to elevate what we call the matter of Britain, so the Arthurian legends and associated stories, to the same level of the classical authors in the eyes of the scholarly community. So before we get to Morgan, I just wanted to do a quick, this is magic in the 12th century. So very much like the whole concept of the witch, magic in the Middle Ages was extremely fluid. So sweeping changes in education, technology, and theology sees the definition of magic shift almost constantly. What is considered magic in one court is not going to be considered magic in the next court over, entirely depending on all three factors. And that meant that different countries, different courts, different villages all reacted to accusations of magic very differently. And as the concept of science developed, lines increasingly began to be drawn about what was science and what was magic. And as a solid foundation formed for magic broadly, what was good or bad, what was permissible or not, or even what constituted witchcraft versus sorcery, all these things began to be questioned. So the increasing Christianization of Europe from late antiquity to this period throws another hat into the ring. So Christian authorities looking to discourage any type of pagan practice declared many rituals and practices acts of magic and thus demonic and illusory in practice. So what had previously been religious worship is now magic because it's not Christian. At the same time, they encouraged similar practices using Christian symbols such as the cross, arguing these signs were efficacious rather than illusory or deceptive because they appealed to God. So quite literally, you could take your little worship ceremony to the goddess Artemis, replace Artemis with a cross, suddenly it's fine. This binary structure of the demonic versus the divine is very, very clear in early medieval writing about the practice of magic, but because the practices are so similar, it's actually really, really hard to determine what was magic and what was religion in this period. However, we still, because of our increased contact with Arabic cultures and Byzantium, get new categories by which we may define magic. Texts that had been lost to Latinate Europe during the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire were preserved in Arabic, Hebrew, and Greek writing. And as Latinate Europe became aware of these texts, we get a booming enterprise of translation. Poets such as Ovid and Virgil, alongside philosophers like Aristotle, become quite popular and are increasingly translated alongside much material that was, in quite self-conscious terms, magic. So we get a lot of spell books, a lot of, crafting recipes. That is what we would term, looking at what the Greeks had, Greek magic. And notably, the rediscovery of magic comes at the same time as this fancy new idea by which knowledge could be separated from all the rest, characterized formally as of a special certainty and associated with careful analysis and logical rigor. This idea, a very early form of the scientific process, was held under the umbrella of natural philosophy. Now, even in its infancy, natural philosophy provided scholars with the tools through which science and magic might be differentiated, although, again, not very clear in every case. And we get 8 brackets of science which fall under its purview. So we get the science of judgments, the science of medicine, agriculture, navigation, alchemy, images, mirrors, and necromancy according to physics. That is not broken down. That is necromancy according to physics. Some of those fairly self-explanatory. Medicine, agriculture, navigation. We know what those are. Judgments dealt with making predictions of the future based on the positions of the stars and planets. So it is actually what we would call astronomy or astrology. Alchemy, which was concerned at this early stage with the creation of gold, eternal life, is still in the very early stages of what would become modern chemistry. The science of images and mirrors both actually reflect early attempts with technology, and were very much concerned with producing wonders. So images, you're looking at automata and robotics. So something like a merry-go-round would actually fall under the science of images. And then the science of mirrors, anything to do with mirrors. So the camera is the perfect example with its reliance on mirrors. And of course, it is the science of necromancy according to physics that is most relevant to us. For it's under this branch of natural philosophy that some of Morgan's abilities can be categorized. Anything that doesn't fall under necromancy goes under medicine. So we're sort of sitting in 2 brackets here. This wasn't actually the practice of raising the dead, as the name implies. Instead, it covered a field that was later described as natural magic by William of Auvergne, and it was concerned with the operation of occult powers, which meant powers that weren't understood at the time. So Stephen Maroon offers what would have been a very common example of an occult power. So the arranging of the production of things such as frogs, lice, and worms, whose generation in the natural world seems to occur spontaneously and not by generation from parents. The emergence of the living being was traced back to seeds buried deeply in certain natural substances, such as decaying flesh. By manipulating such substances, the natural magician could gather together the appropriate seeds and force a spontaneous generation that would astound onlookers. So really, really great example is if you think of your garbage bin at home. It looks perfectly clean. It's all nice, smells a bit, yeah, but you know what garbage doesn't? You put stuff in it, 3 days later, there are flies everywhere. In the medieval world, that would be considered occult because we don't understand where the flies came from. So necromancy, according to physics, pushed the boundaries, borders of nature and understanding of what was and was not possible. And in a society that lacks a basic understanding of physics and biology, many of the world's processes were considered occults, and the ability to manipulate these processes was considered the educated and thus proper practice of magic. So, on to Morgan le Fay. Morgan's first appearance occurs in approximately 1150 in Geoffrey of Monmouth's epic poem, the Vita Merlini, or the Life of Merlin. Written in Latin, the poem tells the story of Merlin's madness following the outbreak of war and the death of King Arthur. The poem is Geoffrey's last extant work and combines Celtic and British mythology, classical perception, and socio-political commentary. Geoffrey was a highly educated man who spent much of his life at Oxford and was by that time the most celebrated seat of learning in the British Isles, and you have got no idea how much that threw me that this bloke went to Oxford. So his education appears to have been extremely wide-ranging, including exposure to British authors such as Gildas and Bede, as well as classical authors such as Cicero, Virgil, Statius, and Ovid. And we can see these influences throughout his work and in the Vita in particular. Geoffrey leaned on these classical authors, especially Virgil, echoing the characteristics of Roman epic poetry. In doing so, like I said, fairly sure he's trying to elevate his own work and the matter of Britain to the same level as the classical writers. And the first sort of way we see this is in the construction of the poem itself. So in order to be considered epic in the Greco-Roman corpus, the poem had to satisfy the following. It had to be written in dactylic hexameter. It had to cover a topic suitably grand as to be worth epic poetry, and it would generally contain a dedication, usually to a muse who was thought to inspire the work. A fourth convention is that it would have either 12 or 24 books, but the Romans abandoned that pretty quickly, so we're not counting that one. Notably, Geoffrey follows all three of the conventions that I listed. So firstly, the Vita is written in dactylic hexameter, and its topic, the madness of Merlin following the outbreak of war and the deaths of his sons, also coheres with epic subjects. It's an echo of the anger of Achilles in the Iliad, or even the escape of the Trojans and their journey in the Aeneid. In each case, the hero undertakes a journey, whether metaphorical or literal, to expose himself to and overcome a particular weakness in his character. For Achilles, this is his rage. For Aeneas, this is his duty to his people. For Merlin, it is his overwhelming grief and resulting madness. And when I say madness, he quite literally bugs off to the forest to live as a hermit instead of ruling as a king. Dude is not in a good place. The poem also connects the mythic past of Arthurian Britain with Geoffrey's contemporary England. Its final reference to the reign of King Stephen serves to place the reign of King Arthur within an historical rather than a mythic context. And this in turn suggests direct stylistic inspiration from both the Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphosis, as both of those poets place their epic within the reign of Augustus, or connected to it. Finally, Geoffrey's Vita begins with a dedication to Robert de Chesney, the Bishop of Lincoln. As I said, dedications are fairly standard in Greco-Roman epic poetry. Generally happens within the first 5 lines, and the speaker would appeal to the gods, most often a muse, with a plea for inspiration and admiration. I do need to note the Aeneid doesn't do that. My theory on that is it's because the whole epic is actually a dedication to Augustus. So, epic length of dedication. So, although Geoffrey's dedication is to a bishop rather than a god, he still includes a plea for the admiration of his work, while also making known his admiration of the bishop. Notably, the Vita isn't the only one of Geoffrey's works to show strong classical influence. His most famous work, The History of the Kings of Britain, is largely written according to the rules of Latin rhetoric, marking it as an historia. This style of writing, informed again by the classical corpus, was defined as an interpretive or explanatory discussion of the past as compared to the Chronicle or Annals, which tend to be more typical of medieval writers, and both of which relied on dates and facts. So that Geoffrey chose to write twice in classically informed styles speaks to the influence of the classical corpus on his education. There is a third text that he wrote, The Prophecies of Merlin. Haven't actually had a chance to check how that's written, but I would not be surprised if it is very similar. Furthermore, as noted by Martin Aurel, the history begins with a detailed allusion to the Aeneid. Did I include this? No, I didn't, but I'll put that up there. So the history begins with the founding of Britain by its namesake Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas, according to the oracle of Diana. This warrior has led the revolt of the Trojans against the Greeks, who had reduced them to slavery. Having crossed the seas, they arrive in the island of Albion, where they fought against giants and founded the city of London, the new Troy. So Oral summary is quite brief, but its links to the Aeneid happen every second line. So aside from recalling the Greco-Roman propensity to enslave those they conquered, Geoffrey's introduction could actually be used as a very broad outline of the Aeneid. His primary hero, Brutus, is even a direct descendant of the mythological hero. And Oral argues Geoffrey deliberately uses this allusion to accord the Britons as a people the glory and status given to the Romans and their great civilization, which again is what I think is happening in the Vita. So consequently, so I said that. So as Virgil sort of seeks to link Rome to Greece and the fall of Troy in the Aeneid, Geoffrey is trying to do the same thing with Arthur and Troy. All right, so his use of the classical tradition as a framework comes to the fore in his depiction of Morgan. She appears towards the end of the poem during a conversation between Merlin and the poet Taliesin, and Taliesin introduces her as follows. So I've got Avalon and Morgan up here because I will be talking about them both. So the island of apples, which is called Fortunate, gets its name from the circumstances of producing everything through itself. It does not need farmers cultivating the land. All cultivation is absent except which nature administers. It produces fruitful crops of its own accord, and apple trees born in its woods with sheared grass. The soil produces all things in the manner of grass, abounding everywhere. So I don't know if any of you have ever had to mow kaikuyu, but imagine stuff like wheat, barley, corn growing like kaikuyu does. That's the image he's trying to convey. In that place, one lives for 100 years or more. In that place, 9 sisters give laws by means of genial rule to those who come to them from our lands. She who is eminent among them is more informed in the skill of healing. She exceeds her sisters with superior form. Her name is Morgan, and she knows of what advantages all the grasses bear, so that she might cure sick bodies. There is also a skill familiar to her by which she knows how to change her shape and how to cut through the sky, just as Daedalus with new feathers. When she wants, she is in Brest, Chartres, and Pavia. When she wants, she glides out of the air into your borders. They say this woman taught mathematics to her sisters. And from here, it goes on to Merlin and company bringing Arthur to her. She sort of gives Arthur a good look over and says, yep, I can heal him, but he's going to have to stay here forever because if he leaves, he will die. And then off they go. Arthur stays behind and she continues on her merry way. So, as we see in this passage, Geoffrey's Morgan has 3 main aspects to her character. The first of these is her position as ruler of the island of Avalon, which she governs with the help of her sisters. This doesn't mean there's no men on the island. Geoffrey is very clear to imply the opposite, explaining that the number of people from our lands have migrated to the island and are subordinate to its female rulers. However, the fertility of Avalon, particularly as it occurs in this passage without the male associated plough, suggests this island is women's space. And since medieval European societies were patriarchal, Geoffrey's description of Avalon lends the island an air of otherworldliness. This place is very back to front, if that makes sense. The second key aspect we get is her role as healer. So female healers were present in 12th century England, although references to them are very uncommon. April Harper does offer one example of Beryl's Tristan, which is one of the earliest extant examples of Arthurian literature. In that text, all female characters practice some form of medicine, and a phenomenon for which Harper suggests the author relied on women's time-honoured position as providers and healers. Geoffrey also relies on this, noting that Morgan's talent for healing is not special because it's a talent for healing, it's because she is the best. She knows the use of all the grasses. and suggests a superior knowledge in conjunction with her superior form. And this reputation for healing follows Morgan throughout all her incarnations, even as authors begin to explore the growing discomfort around the dichotomy between helpful and harmful ways of using magic, and healing pops up in that all the time, because the difference between a poison and a medicine, even today, is still very much the dose. The third key element we get of Geoffrey's Morgan is her intelligence, which she demonstrates not only in her knowledge of plants healing, but also in her ability to use them to change her shape and fly. Moreover, he supports her capacity for learning through the cities she visits. Brest, Chartres, and Pavia were all established centres of ecclesiastical learning during Geoffrey's lifetime. So she is a smarty pants. She goes to where the smarty pants people are. Geoffrey also connects her to the mythological architect Daedalus, as he appears in Book 6 of the Aeneid. He does also appear in Ovid's Met, but in a much more sort of negative frame, which is why I think this is actually the Aeneid rather than the Met. Virgil's version of Daedalus highlights his talents as an inventor and artist, but also explores his propensity for crafting human-animal hybrids, such as the bull-shaped suit he builds for Pasiphae, or the wings he builds for himself and Icarus, which is sort of his most famous exploit. In comparing Morgan to this version of Daedalus, Geoffrey is able to highlight her ability to shape change as one she has gained through her own knowledge or wisdom. He's also hedging his bets a bit here. Depending on who is reading this or where it is being read, he can say, yes, she's using magic, she's actually changing her shape, or no, like Daedalus, she's built herself a set of mechanical wings, which she uses to fly. No magic, just science. So in Geoffrey's Morgan, these key aspects combine to make an entirely positive character. Geoffrey makes absolutely no reference to the early concerns around the use of magic, nor does he denigrate the image of a powerful woman. Morgan's role in the text is to offer hospitality and healing, marking her a beneficent figure. It is, however, important to note that the positive image that Geoffrey presents of Morgan is possible only because she is shown to be highly educated. Common magic, as I said, the magic of the uneducated was still regarded in a negative light because it was both illiterate, and superstitious. Morgan's capacity for learning places her on the same level as the scholarly elite of the 12th century, and thus her abilities fall within the purview of natural philosophy, making them acceptable. So that is the only way he's able to get around that. This, in turn, as I've said, sort of serves to add to the otherworldliness of Avalon. Morgan is a highly educated woman ruling an island led by women that is completely functional without the men it hosts. Geoffrey inverts the typical gender roles and expectations of the 12th century court, creating an almost mirrored image of what would have been expected. The cognitive dissonance this creates, especially in comparison to the elements of Merlin's court that we see, would have been striking to the 12th century mind. All right, so much like the rest of the text, Morgan owes a great deal of her characterization in the Vita to her classical predecessors, beginning with her introduction as one of 9 sisters living on an island paradise. All right. This immediately invites comparison with the 9 muses, the Greco-Roman goddesses of literature, science, and the arts. In Roman mythology, these goddesses were the children of Jupiter and Manatea, I think that's how you say that, goddess of memory. They were believed to have lived on the slopes of Mount Helicon and were considered the source of the knowledge shared through poetry, lyric, and myth. In a similar manner, Geoffrey's 9 sisters, living on an island paradise, are considered sources of knowledge and healing. In particular, Morgan's predilection for mathematics suggests a parallel with Urania, the muse of astronomy. However, it is also possible that Geoffrey is also referring to the Mabinogion, a collection of 11 medieval Welsh stories. Thought to have been compiled early in the second half of the 11th century, that text predates Geoffrey by almost 100 years, and there is a caveat in that in the only extant copy we have of the Mabinogion, actually dates to after Geoffrey. The theory is it's older, but we will never be able to prove it unless we find an older copy. In one of the romances we find in that text, Peredur fab Efrog, and I apologise for my Welsh, the hero Peredur stays 3 weeks with the 9 witches of Caer Low, otherwise known as Gloucester. These witches are powerful mistresses of warfare and have ravaged the kingdoms around them. After defeating one of these witches in battle, Peredur is invited back to Glastonbury, where the witches tutor him and teach him all manner of battlecraft. Having learned all he can, Peredur is gifted with a horse and a weapon on his departure, only to return and slay them as recompense for their murder of his cousin. Some scholars believe that Morgan and her sisters are thus Geoffrey's reinvention of this legend. And this is partially supported by Avalon's supposed real location at Glastonbury Tor. Moreover, like the witches of Glastonbury, Morgan occupies the role of teacher, although in mathematics, not battlecraft. Even considering these similarities, Geoffrey has made significant changes to the idea of the witch that he presents. Morgan and her sisters are largely benign and visit the outside world only in pursuit of knowledge. Avalon itself is also presented as an island paradise rather than a very accessible castle. Moreover, Geoffrey emphasises peace and healing in his depiction of Morgan and her sisters, an image that is directly opposed to the witches of Glastonbury. Therefore, my theory is that if Geoffrey is referencing the Mabinogion here, he's doing so in conjunction with the Greco-Roman muses. This allowed him to blend the muses' reputation for beauty and knowledge with these pre-existing Welsh witches. Thus, Morgan and her sisters are not out of place in the Arthurian landscape as it stood when Geoffrey was writing, but are shown to be entirely benign figures in the way of the Greco-Roman muses. So he's doing a bit of chopping and changing here. So Morgan and her sisters fit within the existing legends. They don't look like they've just been inserted in, but they are very, very different figures. Beyond this evocation of the muses, Geoffrey also relies quite heavily on elements taken from the classical witch Circe as a framework for his Morgan, particularly Circe as she appears in Virgil's Aeneid. And we first see this in the placement of Morgan on the island of Avalon, and so that's sort of a artistic view of Avalon that kind of very much encompasses how mystical this place is supposed to be. But I am just going to go back to the poem so you guys can refer as I'm talking about it. So Avalon itself is actually mentioned for the first time in Geoffrey's history. And as discussed, and it operates as a place of safety from the danger of the ocean, both physically and metaphorically. So islands themselves operate, I've got some editing to do that. Islands operate as liminal space. They represent both safety from the danger of the ocean, physically and metaphorically. The scary things living in the ocean can't get you while you're on land. You're also protected from storms, swells, but also from being things like becalmed, which is where you starve to death because there's no wind. However, because they are also unattached to and often beyond the sight of the mainland, islands are also places of uncivilized wildness and present their own dangers. In the Aeneid, Virgil's description of Circe's island emphasizes this border between safety and danger by juxtaposing the sound of Circe singing as she weaves and the roars and cries of the imprisoned men who have been transformed into animals. Geoffrey's version is not quite so violent, but it still shows Avalon to be a place where normality is suspended. As I've sort of already noted, the lack of masculine coded tools of cultivation such as the plough on the island can be interpreted as a sign of women's space. It's also reminiscent of the wildness of uninhabited places. So you don't find tools of agriculture in places that are wild. When you do, they're not wild anymore. This, in turn, balanced by Morgan and her education, and in particular her visits to hubs of civilization and education, present that a very similar juxtaposition. So The cities not only highlight Morgan's interest in education, but help impose some form of town or castle on Avalon's landscape. This is the burden of assumption on us. She is ruling a place, people are living there. Yes, the food spontaneously comes from the ground, but presumably this woman who's teaching mathematics and is so smart has some form of library, therefore there must be some sort of form of building. So although Geoffrey doesn't explicitly mention these, heavily implied. And the comparison between the landscape of the city and that of the uncultivated, uninhabited nature of the island emphasises Morgan's position as an inhabitant of both and at the same time truly belonging to neither. Like Circe, she is characterised by her home as a liminal figure, both part of the world and not at any one time. Furthermore, like Virgil with Circe's ear, Geoffrey uses Avalon to represent the spiritual liminality between life and death. Virgil's Circe operates as a symbol of the uncivilized past Aeneas is leaving behind on his final journey to what will become the civilization of Rome. For Aeneas, to set foot on Circe's island means death, both literally at Circe's hand and figuratively in the failure to fulfill his destiny and duty. Geoffrey co-opts this concept in his version of Avalon, where he provides one of the earliest incarnations of Arthur's death scene. In introducing the island, as we've seen, he's very careful to mark it as a place of fertility and abundance. And as is also shown through Morgan's ability to heal, Avalon is clearly and consistently connected with the concept of life. However, and Morgan even suggests that should Arthur stay on the island, he might be healed of mortal wounds. So that is the whole reason they bring him to Morgan. There is nobody in Britain who has the skill to stop him from dying. However, if Arthur stays on the island in Morgan's care, he can have no further influence on the events in Britain. He is therefore stuck in limbo, between life and death, that is alive but no longer relevant. In placing Arthur in this position, Geoffrey turns Avalon itself from a place of life into one of death in a way very, very similar to Virgil's representation of Circe's island, a border between the continuity of life and the stagnancy of death. And just as a note there, Geoffrey does actually confirm Arthur's death in the history, and because that came out first, his audience would have been very aware of that. Morgan's abilities also yes, this is an option. Also show Geoffrey's reception of the classical witch. Her knowledge of plants and her skill in healing and transformative magic are all abilities commonly ascribed to Circe and Medea. And his acknowledgement of her knowledge of all the grasses is in fact a direct classical allusion. And this is where I get to that point on Latin we were talking about earlier. So in Greek texts, both Circe and Medea are commonly referred to as polypharmakeis, knowing all the herbs. A term, the root word for which pharmakon was actually adopted into Latin. I'm not 100% sure on why Geoffrey hasn't used it yet, because I only noticed this yesterday. It may be an attempt to distance Morgan's healing from the more malicious and potentially, as we're going to see, sacrilegious versions we see in the Greco-Roman myths. Or it could be that the term simply fell out of use in medieval Europe, and that's kind of the issue that you get when you're studying Roman Latin and medieval Latin. Sometimes words don't sort of travel. However, as Zoe Enstone argues, Morgan's healing skills would also seem to have more closely refer to Medea's legendary rival of Jason's father, as detailed in Ovid's Metamorphosis. So that's what I've put up on the screen here. This is a quote from the Mets detailing the rejuvenation of Aeson. So Medea does all her fun things with going and fetching herbs and all her creepy things with setting up this ritual. She actually ends up cutting Aeson's throat and then pouring this potion into his mouth, and it reverses about 40 years in age. So she's able to cure the condition of old age, restoring Aeson's body to that of a man 40 years younger. And again, more research needed on this point, but I firmly believe this would have been seen absolutely as magic, but also extremely sacrilegious in a Christian environment. What Medea is doing here is not just giving a man 40 years of his life back. She is playing with fate and all sorts of fun things that would not have been okay in this period. So Geoffrey reinterprets, according to Ernstone, Aeson's mortal ailment, which is old age, as Arthur's fatal injuries received in battle. And offering to heal Arthur of his injuries, Morgan echoes Medea's legendary accomplishment. But again, because Morgan can't do that if he leaves the island, there is that little bit of hedging his bets there to separate Morgan from Medea. However, this is not the only way in which Morgan resonates with Medea. In her efforts to collect ingredients for her spell, Medea flies across Greece in her chariot pulled by winged dragons. And correspondingly, Morgan, who turns herself into a bird or somehow gives herself wings, flits about Europe seeking knowledge from cities as noted are significant centres of learning. However, unlike most representations of Medea, again, Geoffrey's portrayal of Morgan is almost entirely positive. Medea starts out positive for about 10 minutes and then starts killing people. So, as Larrington notes, Geoffrey emphasises that Morgan uses her capabilities entirely for good, prioritising her skill with healing and noting that her ability to transform applies only to herself. So even though we are referencing these very, very powerful Greek witches, the lengths that they go to are not lengths that Morgan will go to because she's a nice person. So despite her parallels with Circe and Medea, Geoffrey's Morgan differs in one very significant way from her Greco-Roman predecessors. She is not sexualized at all. Maureen Fries argues that Geoffrey's Morgan is presented instead as an androgynous figure, noting that while she is linked to the traditionally feminine through her capabilities as a healer and the fertility of her island, Morgan is also linked to the masculine through her positions as an independent ruler and teacher. Further, Jill M. Herbert suggests that Morgan's position as Arthur's primary physician gives a masculine aura to the feminine role of healer due to a conflation with the male character of Morgan Tudd, Arthur's personal physician in the story of Geraint in the Mabinogion. So even the name Morgan doesn't really come out of nowhere. Geoffrey's own political leanings may have also had an impact on Morgan's androgyny. So Geoffrey lived and worked during the period known as the Anarchy, a period of civil war between the Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, and Stephen, Count of Blois, Henry's nephew, which ran from 1138 to 1153, the Vita written approximately 1150, smack bang in the middle of it. Well, towards the end, but still within its time period. Geoffrey's support of Matilda becomes apparent in his choice of dedicatees. He dedicates the prophecies of Merlin to Alexander, Bishop of Lincoln, who was a well-known supporter of Matilda. And from 1136, his works were all dedicated to Robert of Gloucester, one of Matilda's chief supporters and her illegitimate half-brother. In his work on Geoffrey's history, Martin Orwell notes that throughout his work, Geoffrey also emphasises the right of heirs, including women, to monarchy. Moreover, in turning to Matilda herself, we see how Geoffrey's loyalty to the Empress shaped at least part of Morgan's character. According to Charles Beam, Matilda was not content to exercise power on behalf of her husband or eldest son, but wished to rule in her own right. In order to do so, she presented herself to the English as a single woman, amplifying her exalted position as the daughter of a king and the widow of an emperor, while downplaying her status as a married woman. At the height of her career, she managed to achieve autonomous agency outside of her status as wife and mother. And you can sort of imagine for a medieval woman, even a queen, this is a fantastic achievement. So in this more political reading, Morgan is representative of powerful royal women Her entirely positive and chaste portrayal can be read as evidence of Geoffrey's support of the Empress. But I also argue that Morgan's androgyny has roots in Geoffrey's ecclesiastical background. In particular, the great increase in the number of convents that occurred in England between 1130 and 1170 suggests that Geoffrey's portrayal of Morgan may have been influenced by the growth in female monasticism. Led by an abbess and living in largely female communities, these convents would have likely been the only actual representation of women's space, as we see in Avalon, with which Geoffrey was familiar. Notably, men can go in and out. These places are places of healing. They're also storage places. There are places you can send your daughters to learn. So we're seeing a lot of sort of commonalities with Avalon. Moreover, unable to marry and bear children, but often free to manage the affairs of the abbey without male interference, nuns would not have been viewed in the same way as eligible women, instead inhabiting an effectively androgynous space within the social structure of the time. That is very a generic statement. Certainly nuns were and treated as women in both good and bad cases. Geoffrey has applied this principle to his portrayal of Morgan and her sisters, resulting in very androgynous figures. So it's perhaps inevitable, considering Geoffrey's own place in history, there are three major forms of influence at play in his depiction of Morgan. I'm sorry, I missed that slide, but I'll leave it up for anyone who's interested. So Geoffrey's use of classical works and characters as a framework for his own is clear, both in the character of Morgan and in the Vita as a whole. Aligning himself with the likes of Ovid and Virgil gave his work gravitas, allowing him to elevate the Arthurian mythology of his own Welsh heritage into a similar literary status as given to classical epics. Moreover, in recasting Welsh tradition into a classical framework, Geoffrey was able to bypass the traditional iconography and associations of Welsh and British ideas of witchcraft that existed at the time, as we see in the Mabinogion, allowing him to convey the more academic impressions of magic that were coming to the fore in the 12th century. This, in turn, allowed him to portray Morgan as a powerful and positive character that blended seamlessly into Arthurian legend. What results in Geoffrey's Morgan is a contemporary political allegory of the war between Stephen and Matilda. Morgan's